Thanks everybody for coming to our today's Rochester Rich History presentation. My name is Antoine McDonald. I'm one of our librarians here in the local history and genealogy division. And I'm just happy to introduce Brian and his presentation today on Julia Sauer, a previous employee of this building. So without further ado.
Thanks, Antoine. Hi there. My name's Brian Gibson, and I'm an associate professor of English literature and film at a very small, primarily French-speaking university in Nova Scotia. A few years ago, after I contacted Brandon Fess about the material that the Rochester Library had on file concerning Julia L. Sauer, as part of research that I was doing for a paper on her 1943 novel, Fog Magic, Brandon was kind enough to invite me to give this little presentation. So I'd like to thank Brandon for this opportunity and also for his remarkable professionalism, his enthusiastic support, and his help with research material, including the provision of 2 photos of Julia Sauer. I also want to thank Antoine McDonald here at the library for his help and support. Now, my apologies if this all seems a little bit read out, but the best and easiest way to talk to you is by reading from a prepared script. If it ends up sounding a tad hollow or forced, especially because of this distance remote medium, then I hope that's offset somewhat by the sense that it's more polished and carefully written. And at the end, of course, feel free to ask a question that you may have. Last but by no means least, I should note that the Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County has recently established, thanks to the generosity of a former librarian, Barbara Billingsley, who's here today, an archive of Julia L. Sauer's professional and personal papers. They are all carefully organized and inventoried. So if you'd like to learn even more about Julia L. Sauer, please avail yourself of that new public resource. Now, my work has focused on Fog Magic, the first book for children by Julia Lena Sauer. But for a bit more background and context first, I'll give you an outline of Sauer's life and career. She was born to Emma Horrett and William A. Sauer in Rochester on April 8, 1891, in a decade when the city's population would surpass 150,000 people for the first time. Although in Julia Sauer's words she was, quote, an only child, I cannot remember being a lonely one, unquote. Her father built a roofed platform atop a 1-story addition to the back of their home on Ontario Street, and this treehouse-like place, in Sauer's recollection, quote, served the entire neighborhood. Here, through the long, hot summer afternoons, we read everything we could get our hands on, unquote. The only career that she and her friends contemplated at the time was that of authorship. When Sauer was 18, her mother died at the age of 51 of pneumonia. After graduating from East High School, Sauer went to the Women's College at the University of Rochester, to which female students were first admitted in 1900, thanks to the efforts of Susan B. Anthony and Helen Barrett Montgomery. Sauer was literary editor of the college's yearbook, and the short poem next to her picture in that publication includes these lines, quote, if you want someone to write a story, there's no one can do quite so well, unquote. During her senior year, Sauer worked in the first children's room of the Rochester Public Library, and it was there that she discovered her vocation. She graduated from college in 1914, and then she studied for a year at the New York State Library School in Albany. Then, for a time, she organized the Rochester Playground Library program for children. An example of it can be seen here, and that is likely Sauer conducting story hour, though it is not known for sure. Sauer soon returned to the Rochester Public Library, and in 1921 she became head of the children's department at the library, succeeding the woman who had hired her during her last year in college. At the newly constructed Rundle Memorial Building, Sauer instituted a clinic service that offered parents help in choosing reading material for their children. From 1934 to 1939, Sauer was heavily involved in radio book talks and storytelling for children, including her library's Rochester School of the Air programs, and she reported to the American Library Association on radio programs for children. This work led to a book that Sauer edited called Radio Roads to Reading, Library Book Talks broadcast to girls and boys. Indeed, all three of Sauer's children's books would be adapted from or adapted into radio scripts. Radio was such a popular medium then that by 1940, there were more than 30 million radios in the United States, a country of only 131 million people at the time. One children's radio program on CBS received around 1,000 letters a week from listeners. In 1941, Sauer, who was by then a children's librarian of some renown beyond Rochester and even New York State, waded into the national debate about whether books for children should be imaginative or realistic. She argued that realistic fiction for children, reflecting their emotional and socio-political worlds, was much needed, and she championed, as an example, Doris Gates's Newbery Award-winning novel, Blue Willow, which was a bit like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath for young readers. 2 years later, Sauer published her first children's book, Fog Magic, which won her Rochester's Lillian Fairchild Prize, an annual award for creative art. She was 52 years old. Her second book was published 8 years later, in 1951, and her last, Mike's House, about a 4-year-old who thinks that his favorite book's main character lives in the library, came out in 1954. Sauer retired in 1958 and was honored with a citation and a library school scholarship in her name. She died in Rochester on June 26, 1983, at the age of 92. Now, back to Sauer's best-known book. Fog Magic, published in 1943, is the story of a Nova Scotian girl, Greta, who loves the fog and finds, while she is 10 and 11, that she can travel on foggy days back to the year 1800, visiting the seaside village of Blue Cove, just over the ridge from her home, that has been abandoned by her time in the early 1940s. Fog Magic was named as a Newbery Honor Book, so a runner-up to the top prize of the Newbery Medal, the country's most prestigious prize given to a children's book author, awarded annually by a division of the American Library Association. Sauer's second of 3 children's books, The Light at Turn Rock, was also a Newbery Honor book. Those 2 works are based on Sauer's time in Nova Scotia and set in the area where she spent her summer holidays in the province. For her second book, Sauer said that she heard the story from a local, an old fisherman to whom it happened in the 1860s, the decade of Confederation, when Canada became an independent country. In the course of working on my paper on Fog Magic, excuse me, I came across some neat little tidbits, factoids, and curious Canadian connections that I've tried to organize here to present to you. At least, I hope you'll find them neat, perhaps even fascinating. Most of you, I suspect, know how it is when you start to tumble, like Alice into Wonderland, down the rabbit hole of the internet. And before you know it, you've darted around here and there, bumping into one curiosity after another. It's less of an information superhighway at times, though, than a series of byways or now and then blind alleys. Or perhaps they seem like secret rooms. According to one of Sauer's colleagues, a woman to whom Sauer dedicated her third and last book, it was Sauer who suggested that there be a secret room in the children's section of the Rundle building here on South Avenue. A similar secret room is now in the library's Bauschen Loan building across the street. So, speaking of streets and byways, the title I've given to this presentation then is a metaphorical image taken from the very start of Fog Magic. In the acknowledgments that Sauer makes to, quote, our friends in Little River, she writes, you have dipped far down into your memories for us, and the tales you have told are in themselves like an old road into the past. I hope that this presentation takes us a little way down a few bumpy old roads into the past, too. The Little River that Sauer writes of was the small village where she summered in southwest Nova Scotia, usually with a friend, Alice Waters of nearby Pulteneyville, here in New York State, from the early 1930s until the 1960s. It's on a long peninsula called Digby Neck that is right across the water of the Baie Sainte-Marie, or St. Mary's Bay in English, from my micro-university. In fact, on most days, I can see Digby Neck in the distance from my office window. Before I get to why Sauer herself summered in Nova Scotia, though, in Little River, I should take you down the first old road. There's a long, colorful, and interesting history of Americans, or more generally, come-from-aways, visiting or relocating or living part-time in Nova Scotia. In part, this is because of a centuries-long historical connections, usually involving fishing, shipbuilding, and trade between Nova Scotia and New England. In 1896, for example, Harry Houdini's first tour outside the United States as an assistant with his wife Bess for the Marco Magic Company began with his stop in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Yarmouth is about an hour south as the crow flies from Digby Neck. A quarter century later, Chicagoan Leo Koretz perpetrated one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history. It was a scam in the roaring 20s that saw him fleece investors for what would be more than $400 million today. And Koretz ended up fleeing the authorities by crossing the border in 1923 and living in southwest Nova Scotia until he was arrested the following year in Halifax, the province's capital city. And then there are the more recent and respectable American artist part-time emigres. The New Yorker writer Calvin Trillin has summered on the south shore of Nova Scotia since the 1970s. The late great photographer Robert Frank, best known for his 1958 photo book, The Americans, lived for at least part of every year on Cape Breton Island since the 1970s. And from within Canada, Noah Richler, remember that name, an author and the son of famed Montreal novelist Mordecai Richler, who penned his own children's classic, Jacob Tutu Meets the Hooded Fang, has summered just up the road from Little River at Sandy Cove on Digby Neck for many years now. Which brings me back to Sauer. She apparently began summering right near Little River in Digby Neck after taking so many of her vacations in Canada. A publicist at Macmillan, the Toronto-based publisher that brought Fog Magic out in Canada, wrote to Julia Sauer in April 1944, asking for a bit of biographical information and wondering, quote, how you happened to have a cabin in Nova Scotia, unquote. Sauer, in her reply, noted that she had spent time during her, quote, college years on a Canadian island near Gananoque, one summer in Algonquin Park, another with a cousin who has an island far north of Sudbury, unquote, and also once at Ojibwe, by which she probably meant Ojibwe Provincial Park in northern Ontario, between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. The past 13 summers, Sauer continued, she had spent in Nova Scotia, after exploring Digby Neck on the third trip to the province with her friend Alice Waters. In 1938, they bought a small plot of land, cleared some trees there themselves, and had the local carpenter build their cabin, which they named Small Size. Here's the first page of a letter that Sauer, so happy about the acceptance of Fog Magic for publication by children's book editor May Massey at Viking Press, wrote to Massey in late 1942. Massey, by the by, had started out as a librarian and worked for a time at the children's room in the Buffalo Public Library. In the letter, Sauer talks about why she agrees with Massey that the book should have few illustrations and remarks that the setting is, quote, very real Nova Scotia, unquote. Indeed, the property next to the one where Sauer and Waters summered was owned by the Addington family. And Addington is Greta's last name in Fog Magic. This map shows those lots as of 1946, and I've marked out where White's Cove, on which Blue Cove is imaginatively based, lies relative to where Sauer's cottage was. By the way, many of the last names noted in Fog Magic, such as Addington, Stanton, Trask, and Tidd, can be found on headstones in the graveyard of Little Rivers Baptist Church, the steeple of which is visible from where Sauer's cottage was. And Tiddville is the name of the town just down the road from Little River. But Sauer wasn't the only award-winning children's author who summered in the area at the time. Alice Dalgleish, a children's book editor, summered in a cottage at Sandy Cove on Digby Neck, which is just a few miles up the road from Little River. It is not known, however, if Sauer and Dalgleish knew each other. Dalgleish authored more than 30 children's books, from picture books to novels, and 3 of her books were set on Digby Neck in the early 30s, a decade before Sauer's Fog Magic. Dalgleish won a Newbery Honor for 3 of her books, including her semi-autobiographical The Silver Pencil, which won a Newbery Honor in 1945. And that was the year that Julia L. Sauer was on the awards committee. Sauer was likely on the committee, usually made up of mostly librarians, because her debut, Fog Magic, had garnered a Newbery Honor the year before, in 1944. Another Canadian connection here can be found in that Newbery Committee which honored Fog Magic in 1944. One of the members of the award committee was Lillian H. Smith, the first children's librarian in the British Empire. She was based in Toronto, and she set up a classification system for children's books that remained in place until the 1970s. Smith was posthumously honored with the naming of a branch building in the Toronto Public Library system after her. This is the front entrance to the building here. And in coincidental fact, Lillian H. Smith died in the same year, 1983, as Julia L. Sauer. Now, another Trans-Canada highway that runs through Sauer and Fog Magic concerns the illustrator of the novel. His name was Lynd Ward, and he was the son of a progressive theologian who was also a founding member and the first chairman of the American Civil Liberties Union. When he was a very young boy in Chicago, Lynd Ward got tuberculosis, and so his parents took him to a family cabin on Lonely Lake, near Sault Ste. Marie in northern Ontario, to recover. After studying fine art in New York and in Leipzig, Ward settled in New Jersey and began to illustrate books. He would go on to illustrate more than 100 books for adults and nearly 100 books for children, 5 of them Newbery Honor books and 2 of them Newbery Medal winners. Influenced by some wordless European books that he had read while he was studying in Germany, Ward created the first American picture novel without words, and it was published in 1929, mere days before the stock market crash. God's Man, a novel in woodcuts, which sold more than 20,000 copies, was followed by 5 more such works throughout the 1930s, and these were the forerunners of the graphic novel in the United States. But Ward was even more concerned, perhaps, with realism and political relevance in children's books than Sauer. For instance, he illustrated his wife Mae McNear's biography of Lincoln, offering a striking image of the revolutionary abolitionist John Brown. And he illustrated Hoyt Swift's North Star Shining, a pictorial history of the American Negro, 1947, featuring a drawing of a resolute Harriet Tubman striding ahead, an owl over her shoulder. Ward only contributed 3 drawings to Fog Magic because the book's editor, Mae Massey at Viking, and Sauer herself didn't want many illustrations. But he, like Sauer, regularly summered in Canada. Only Ward and his family spent their summers in northern Ontario, at Lonely Lake, where he had spent time as a sickly infant. My suspicion then is that the trees in 2 of his 3 illustrations of Fog Magic, for instance this one, of a house in the foggy woods, are not really based on the spruce-covered landscape of Digby Neck that Sauer describes. These trees are based perhaps on the conifers of the Canadian Shield near Sault Ste. Marie that Ward would have seen summer after summer for nearly 60 years of his life. Both Sauer and Ward were likely attracted, at least in part, to the sense of remoteness and wilderness that they found in Canada. And that brings me to the local postscript, 2 generations later, to Sauer's Fog Magic, the story of a battle over the seaside spot that lies at the heart of Fog Magic. When I moved out to Nova Scotia to take the job at the micro-university on the shore of Baie Sainte Marie, across from Digby Neck, it was 2 years after a long, hard-fought environmental battle on the peninsula had been decided at last. In fact, it may well have been because of the environmental fight on Digby Neck that I was told about Sauer's book and so ended up reading it. I honestly can't remember. What happened was this. In April 2002, a family in Little River noticed a drilling rig going up a little-used road near their house, over the ridge, and down towards the area that, in Fog Magic, is called the other side of the mountain. After some local dismay, and then some inquiries, it emerged that Bilcon, a shell company whose parent firm was in New Jersey, was proposing a 150-hectare quarry and marine terminal in order to ship out the basalt mined from the quarry in White's Cove to the United States. Now, White's Cove, remember, is the inspiration for Blue Cove in Fog Magic, the 1800 fishing village abandoned in her time, to which Greta travels in the fog. isolated and unpopulated. A coalition of opponents to the proposal quickly grew in number, voice, and power. Stop the quarry signs were put up. Concerns were raised about the effect of the project on the fishery and on marine animals. According to local teacher Michael Corbett, an adaptation of Sauer's novel was staged by students as a play called Magic Fog in the area school, and it, quote, helped galvanize community opposition to the quarry and terminal construction, unquote. The municipality voted against the quarry, and a petition opposing the project was signed by nearly 2/3 of Digby Neck's permanent residents. In 2004, a joint federal-provincial environmental review of the project was announced. In a traditional knowledge consultation report commissioned by Bilcom and included as one of the environmental impact documents, Fog Magic garnered a section unto itself, as can be seen here. The section is digressive, and the cultural importance and relevance of the book are downplayed. And the authors note that many of the locals they interviewed were aware, quote, of the significance of this piece of literature to future tourism potential, unquote. Spoiler alert. On Digby Neck today, there is no Fog Magic amusement park, complete with the Greta Ghoster Coaster or Julia Sauer log flume ride. In an anti-quarry document issued by the Partnership for Sustainable Development of Digby Neck and Island Society, the authors listed valued environmental components of the area, including local folklore and Sauer's book. They included, in the appendix, summertime Digby Neck resident Noah Richler's 2002 piece for a national Canadian newspaper, where he urged the local Conservative Party minister, who was pro-quarry, to read Fog Magic, even though he has probably, quote, long since forgotten the magic of childhood, unquote. Richler pushed the romance so far as to state that, quote, what Anne of Green Gables is to Prince Edward Island, or Huckleberry Finn is to Mississippi, Fog Magic is to the Digby Neck, unquote. Well, however true or untrue that is, and however much of a difference Sauer's book made, in late 2007, a decision on the quarry was reached. Bilcon's proposal was rejected by an environmental review panel, and its conclusion was accepted by the provincial government. White's Cove, or Blue Cove, as it is known to many readers, remains untouched on the windswept northern coast of Digby Neck, not far along an old road into the past from where Julia L. Sauer spent so many of her summers. Thank you. Got time for, of course, questions, and there's also, I have 2 Easter eggs, like little tidbits about the book that I couldn't fit in that I can mention at some point during the questions. If you want to see my sources for my presentation, my sources are here. Anyway, I can leave them up. So. Any people have any questions? Feel free, lots of time. Yes?
Does the Sauer cabin still exist?
I think it does, but when my partner and I went to visit the area to see if the Sauer cabin still exists, we only talked to one local who seemed to think that it was the one that we found up on the hill, and it makes sense, the location. I don't know if anyone's living there or not. You remember, Ash, if we saw?
There was someone there, yeah.
There was someone there, so it seems to be the case that it still exists. It's still standing, yeah. Yes, in the back first, and then Of course, yeah, sorry. He was just asking if the cabin still exists, the Sauer cabin still exists, that they nicknamed Small Size there in Little River.
There is a cousin of Alice Waters sitting here in the audience. I don't know if you've already been introduced to each other.
Yeah, I think
Chip Stevens. Chip, what did you went up to Nova Scotia? What did you find?
Found a lot of fog and a lot of rural wind-blown areas.
Yeah.
I went up there as an artist to paint. Of course, you can't paint much in the fog. But anyway, I was looking for Alice Waters' cabin or cottage, and I didn't know where to look exactly. Digby drove around the waterline, Bay of Fundy and so on, and I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything that would look like a 1920s cottage cabin.
I mean, the reason I found it is because there is this really old website, it dates from the, well, not really old, really old for internet, dates from the early 2000s that mentions the cottage and shows a picture of the cottage, and so then from that I could sort of figure it a little bit, and we talked to some locals, but I don't think you had that advantage then, Chip, of when you went out, right? So.
Does that site still exist? That website?
Yeah. I can tell you or show you where it is. It's
I
still
looked
on.
at a map and it looked like there was like one road that goes out to what's called White's Cove. Is that where we're talking about?
There's no road that gets you to White's Cove. It's only a sort of old cart track, a stone. I'd say it's an old cart track. Wouldn't you say, Ash? That we followed out. You can walk out, but you cannot. There's no way you could get there by car.
So basically what you said, the cabin you thought you found is on this road, this track, where you really...
Cabin you could get to by road, and then the road stops a little bit after it. In terms of getting anywhere by car, you'd have to walk out to over the ridge, over the mountain, down to the area that's White's Cove, or it's actually over just to the northeast would be White's Cove.
I'm Cynthia Houck that gave you that email.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm an architectural researcher. That's why I'm asking these specific
Yeah,
questions.
sure, yeah.
Because we wondered, Chip and I and Chip's wife, Georgia, we've known each other for years, and this has just stumbled on our radar screen in the last couple of weeks.
Right.
So of course we're talking about, because he heard from Alice and knew the family about the cabin, so we all wondered, is this building still there? Because Chip's an architect.
Yeah. We can get up there in the summer and take a photo for you and send it to you. And I can make a few more inquiries maybe with locals to see.
It's hard to know if it was that one or if it was a different.
Yeah, I think it was, but yeah.
I'd love to see what it looks like now.
Sure, yeah.
And as an artist, I can paint fog around it.
Yeah, of course.
So the area has not been overdeveloped with tourism, it sounds like.
No, we're talking about a small province, right? And that part of the province, go back. That part of the province especially is not have a lot of people, and if anything, of course, Nova Scotia suffers from a lot of rural depopulation, so more and more people are moving away from rural areas and small areas, including this area, and they tend to move other provinces, especially to the cities such as Halifax. So it's really not a lot of tourism to speak of, but nowhere close to the levels that you're used to in the United States when it comes to tourism. It's not anywhere even remotely close. Yeah. It's only a province of 1 million people, and half of those live in Halifax. So it's really, yeah.
What were the settings for Sauer's other books?
Second book, the Lighthouse at Turn Rock. That's also Nova Scotia, and I think it's also probably, it's been a while since I read it, but I believe it's this area around Digby Neck. But Mike's house is Rochester, and the library. Here, I believe it's the downtown library. Do you remember, Barbara?
This
It's
building.
this building.
It's this building.
It's this building, yeah.
Yeah. Down on, and he came up to the second floor, which is where the children's room,
Oh, okay, right.
and the original secret door and all.
Secret room, which,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I had another question.
Yeah.
Did Julia Sauer initially go up there with Alice Waters, or had she gone up there before that?
I think they went up together, but I don't know if
that she and Alice went up together and were so taken
Taken with
by
it.
the place.
I think that's right.
Just kept going back
Yeah.
again. I don't recall that in that letter she talks about why they decided to go up there, but
No.
she mentions that I think they went up together.
Because that's a long drive. unless
It,
it's a-
especially then.
Although my sense is that they stayed quite a long time when they were there.
But I wondered if
for
they
a
took a
week.
ferry over, because there have been ferries from Portland to
Right.
Maine for years, so, because that.
Yeah, I don't know if there was a ferry then.
Expressway,
Maybe.
That's a long drive.
I don't know if there was a ferry then. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a long drive, especially then when this is before, you know, the highways we're used to today.
And
It's a very long.
my understanding is that Alice died up there.
Right.
Yes, yeah, that's what you informed me about, that she died up there. Right? Other questions that people have? Like I said, I have two more little interesting tidbits, but feel free to ask. Yeah?
I wanted to mention something about, you mentioned that Julia was an only child. She was, but in reality, she was one of 3 children. I don't know if you had seen the information from Mount Hope Cemetery and her family's gravesite. She was a survivor of 3 children. And the family gravesite over here at Mount Hope Cemetery, which is our big Victorian
Right.
cemetery, she was born in what, 1880 something or other? There were 2 boys, one that lived not even a year and one that lived maybe 2 years.
She was born in 1891.
Okay, so
Okay.
she was the last. They had lost 2 boys.
It's quite common at the time, yeah.
Yeah, before she was born. So
Sure.
yes, she only surviving child, but she was the survivor. They had 2 children they'd lost, so she was probably particularly cherished by her parents.
Yeah, probably. I would be speculative. Sure. Although remember, you know, infant mortality rates are very high, so arguably the attitude to children is a bit different from our attitude to children today.
Yes.
We tend to see children as quite precious
Right.
the last 100 years or so. But I'm just speaking as somebody who teaches children literature and a little bit about children's history. Arguably, the attitude to children changed a fair bit right through the 1800s. So it's hard to say. You'd have to be sure. You'd have to find letters from her parents or whatever.
I shouldn't have maybe used the word cherished, but after losing 2 children and then you have a 3rd child, and you must have been thinking.
Yeah, you would think so. You would think so.
Yeah,
Sure.
you
Yeah.
consider that would be
Yeah.
a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they must have been very proud of her because
Well,
she was the first person. She went to college. I mean, her father was a carpenter, I think. And you know, this was a daughter who did
Yeah.
really well, and not only went to college and you know got the job that she did, but she was nationally known
Yes.
and winning
Absolutely.
awards, and
Yeah.
it must have been.
Yeah, and her father lived till 1946, so he saw all of this acclaim that she
The more interesting part for me in terms of death in the family, but it's because my focus is on the book, Fog Magic, is how the death of her mother probably affected her. And I think, you know, one of the most fascinating things about Fog Magic is how full of grief it is. It's so interested in grief and death. Set at a time in World War II, where kids reading the book all know that the war is affecting, the war is this huge thing going on, right? And this is around the time, this is even just 2 years after the U.S. joins, comes in on the Pacific Front. And it's interesting grief, which is almost in every page. Arguably, that's the main sort of fog of the book, is that interesting grief. And probably, but who knows, it's entirely speculative, and I'm not so interested in bringing biographical facts in the books, but probably that losing her mother when she did would be some of the reason why we see so much of the book saturated with grief, interesting grief, and trying to help children sort of reckon with and deal with death. But again, it's speculative.
Not really. The studies show that when women lose their mothers, it is a very, very different experience.
Right. Other questions or? Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the book. Is it still available in libraries today? Is it-
Oh yes, yeah, for sure. And you can still order new copies. It's still in print. Yeah, it's still in print. Yeah, I just taught it to
person from Nova Scotia?
I don't know. It's a good question. I haven't come across any. I have two little details of two aspects of fog magic that are based on true stories that I know of, but I don't know about Mrs. Morrow. She's based on a real person. She may be. She may well be. It's interesting that she mentions the name Trask in the book, because Reginald Trask is apparently the name of the carpenter who built their cabin. So little things like that, right? These little sort of homages and tributes, but how close any of the characters actually are to people she knew, I don't know if you know. I don't know if it's possible to find out, because I don't think any of her letters about her creation of the book were that detailed, or if there's any documents about her creation of the book that are that detailed, I'm not sure.
I think she liked to do that. That Mike's House, the picture book that's
Yeah.
about the boy coming here,
Yeah.
has a number of characters in it who were based on real people.
Right.
Including the policeman, and in fact there's I think a letter in the file that she talks about, after that book came out, Sibley's, Lindsay and Kerr, which is a big department store here in Rochester,
Right.
and had a book department, had a big event, and she was there and signed the book and all that kind of stuff, and in this letter she talks about, and I can't remember the real policeman's name now, that she was writing to a friend, and it sounded as if she said, as if he sort of thought that it was all about him. He was kind of up there in a very kind of gentle way.
Right.
But she seemed to like, I think, bringing real people into
Yeah.
her books.
And I think that can happen a lot with authors, where they, someone who knows them think that, they like to think this is me in the book, right? So dealing with that. Well, very quickly then, there's two episodes or sort of stories within Fog Magic, because Fog Magic is a story that has a lot of stories within it. And one is this man named Jerome. Well, he's called Anthony in Fog Magic, and he's a legless man, and they don't know where he came from. He was just found on the coast, and he speaks a language no one can understand. And that's based on a true story. It's a pretty well-known local legend in the area. There was a legless man who was called Jerome by the people who found him, or people he ended up living with, who died in 1912. Now, the episode with Anthony is set in the time when she goes back, 1800, Blue Coast. So what Sauer did was move it back in time. But in reality, the legless man named Jerome, who died in 1912, was found on the beach near Sandy Cove, which is, you can see just up, I wish I could point at it. Why not? Just up here. It's actually on this side, so just up the coast from Blue Cove. Blue Cove is around here. And so he was found on that coast there, about 3 miles up coast from White's Cove, in September 1863, found by an 8-year-old boy. And the tale of Jerome, according to Noah Ritzler, became a bona fide mystery that was kept alive first in newspapers, then in radio fireside tales. Jerome rarely spoke, and he mostly only spoke to children in an unknown tongue. And he ended up going to live on the mainland, I think in Sauniaville area down there, with Acadian families. And he died in 1912. The other true story is, or what's based on a true story, is the tale in the book of Mrs. Stanton, who walks all the way to Halifax to get justice. That's based on a woman who's a German-speaking woman named Margaret Davis, who walked in 1828 from her home in Briar Island. Obviously, she didn't walk on water, but she got across to Long Island, then got across to Digby Neck, and then walked to Halifax to defend her deed of ownership, which she had signed with an X, because of course, like most people at the time, she was illiterate. She went to defend her X-signed deed of ownership against a stranger's claim. And she won that defense after meeting in Halifax and arguing her case to a German-speaking judge. And there's a CBC article that I got that information from, but there's been a ferry that runs between, I think it's between Briar Island and Long Island, that's been named after her, Margaret Davis. So those two stories in fog magic are based on real stories. Yeah. Any other questions that people have, or? Yeah?
She's the one who met the Duke of Kent?
Yes, in the book.
Yeah.
She's, so what Sauer does in the book is she turns it into a bit of a Cinderella story, and she meets the Duke of Kent, and then, anyway, you'd have to read it. I don't want to, but it's also interesting to note how Sauer, she makes it more white. She doesn't have her speaking German, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a way in which she, I don't know how you might want to phrase it, but normalizes it, regularizes it, makes it more Anglo-Saxon, that story. It's interesting what Sauer does there.
Well, probably German would have been unpopular at that time.
Yeah, that's sort of, that may be what, but I don't, but it was set in 1800,
That's true.
right? And so she could have had her speak, so it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting too, speaking of Germany and the war, that Greta's noted a few times wearing a beret, and I wonder if that's a bit of a nod to the French resistance at the time, a nod of solidarity with the French, 1943, what they're going through with the Germans. Speaking of Germany, 1943, yeah. Other questions, or yeah?
One question, I guess, of Barbara, because she and Brandon, are there many photographs in the papers that were saved
No.
and brought?
No, and the papers that I had were it was a very odd situation, how I got them. Did you know Bill Cox, who was head of the Central Library?
Yes, and that very modern
they-
house on
Yeah,
Reservoir Avenue.
right, on Reservoir.
Yes.
He called me, this is years ago, he called me one day when I was still working at the library and said, I have this box of Julia Sauer stuff. Do you want it? And I said, yes. I do want it. He said, oh, I'm clear now. I just want to get rid of this stuff. So he gave it to me. And what he said was that it was given to him by a young couple who had just recently bought a house on his street. They knew that he had worked for the library. This was after he retired. They knew that he had worked for the library. And they looked enough at the stuff in it and thought, well, we probably shouldn't throw this away. So they gave it to Bill. And I then, and Bill didn't mention this, which I thought was maybe a little surprising, or maybe he didn't know it. I was curious about how this stuff came to be in this house. But it was all a jumble. I mean, it was just a mess of stuff.
Because I looked up her address, she lived on Collinwood Drive in Arundecoit, and then she moved over to East Avenue.
But there was a woman, Jessie Holloway, who was a librarian at the Rochester Public Library, who lived in a house on Reservoir. I think, I don't know this for sure, but the only thing I can think is that was the house that this couple bought. How Jessie Holloway got this stuff, I don't know. I did a little bit of searching in some of the RPL stuff that's online, and I certainly think they overlapped, and I think there might even be a mention in one of those letters, I can't remember, of Jessie. So I suspect that's how they ended up with her, but it still is very odd, very odd. But it's very interesting because there are these letters to Mae Massey and other people. I mean, there's some really interesting stuff in there that I would never know about before. As far as we know, there aren't copies of these letters around.
No.
In other institutions or places like that. So, yeah, it was very interesting. Yeah. So now they're in local history.
Any other questions or comments? Brad?
My question goes back to something you commented on, that you taught the book in a maritime literature class recently.
And then could you talk up a little
Sorry.
while? I have that over here.
Sorry, my question comes from the fact that you mentioned that you taught the book recently in a maritime literature class.
Yeah.
And not knowing the literature of maritimes at all, just fit into a larger literary tradition, or is it an outlier coming from an outsider?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not really an expert in Canadian lit or even in maritime lit. It's just a class I have to teach. And I really enjoyed teaching it. I did a lot of prep for it. But it's hard to say if it fits into how it fits into a longer tradition of maritime literature. I mean, it probably, you'd have to look at what is the tradition of maritime literature for children. Even comparing it with some of the stuff that Doug Leash wrote, set on Digby Neck. That would probably be the sort of tradition it's working in, but I don't know. I think the interesting thing about Fog Magic is that so much of it seems to be based on stories she heard from the locals there on Digby Neck, and so it almost feels like a sort of a one-off book that way. That it's very much based on the stories that she heard, other people talking around the fire, telling around the fire, as she sort of herself says in the acknowledgments to the book. There are little things there, especially the way that it deals with depopulation. She's going back to Blue Cove, and this is a fishing village that in Greta's time has been abandoned. I mean, and that is an issue that persists in Nova Scotia today, right? There's such rural depopulation in the province, and also in Newfoundland. I mean, the history of Newfoundland is a famous history of people voting whether or not to stay in these remote outpour communities. And even in the cases of the 60s, 70s, 80s, there's famous photos of Newfoundland of them taking houses away by water, right? And moving people out of remote outports that people have known their whole lives. So this sort of rural depopulation is perhaps the most interesting element of the book in terms of grappling with a sense of loss of the past, loss of past communities. Your ancestors, there's almost nothing that remains of them except these stone slabs that mark out the doorsteps, right, to homes that are long gone. So that's, I think, an aspect of the book that's really, really interesting, how it reflects a maritime that's lost more and more of the markers of its past. Yeah.
How long is Digby Neck?
Oh, I don't.
I mean, on the map, obviously, it looks huge.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's if you go from Digby up there and you go down to just past Sidville to take the ferry, it's about a 45-minute drive.
Okay.
Yeah, 50-minute drive, and then Long Island is about a 20-minute drive, one into the other, and they have the ferries timed so that you can. Yeah. No, it's not that. It's not that long. It's not that long. I don't know the distance though. I should know it, but you can find out online. Any other questions? Yeah.
If I come across any Julia Sauer's letters, I've got boxes of old photographs and letters. Should I give them to Rundle Library or to you?
Talk to Brandon right there. If anybody comes across any Julia Sauer, talk to Brandon. They got the archive set up. Absolutely. Yes. Sure they would appreciate it.
I could tell you all about Alice Waters' house in Tobyville.
Yeah. That might be useful. I don't know. Talk to Brandon.
Was it a fruit farm? Somewhere I thought I saw that she had a fruit farm. Was that
Oh, yeah.
true?
Oh,
Was that
see.
what it was?
Show it to you.
You've probably driven past it, if you've ever gone to Pokemon, you've driven past his house.
It's a cobblestone house, built about 1845. Map of Pokemon. The harbor